During the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Confederate Gen.Robert E.Lee attempted to capitalize on his first day's success. He launched the Army of Northern Virginia in multiple attacks on the flanks of the Union Army of the Potomac, commanded by Gen. George G. Meade. The assaults were unsuccessful, and resulted in heavy casualties for both sides. After a short delay to assemble his forces and avoid detection in his approach marched Lt. Gen. James Longstreet attacked with his 1st Corps against the Union left flank. His division under Gen. John Bell Hood attacked Little Round Top and Devil's Den. To Hood's left, Gen. Lafayette McLaws attacked the wheat field and the peach orchard. Although neither prevailed, the Union 3rd Corps was effectively destroyed as a combat organization as it attempted to defend a salient over too wide a front. Gen. Meade rushed as many as 20,000 reinforcements from elsewhere in his line to resist these fierce assaults. The attacks in this sector concluded with an unsuccessful assault by the 3rd Corps Division of Gen. Richard H. Anderson against the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. That evening, Confederate 2nd Corps Commander Lt. Gen. Richard S. Jewell turned demonstrations against the Union right flank into full-scale assaults on Culp's Hill and East Cemetery Hill, but both were repulsed. The Union Army had occupied strong defensive positions, and Meade handled his forces well, resulting in heavy losses for both sides but leaving the disposition of forces on both sides essentially unchanged. Lee's hope of crushing the Army of the Potomac on Northern territory was dashed, but undaunted, he began to plan for the third day of fighting. This article includes details of many attacks on the Union left flank and center, but separate articles describe other major engagements in this massive battle of the second day. Little Round Top, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill. Background: military situation. Opposing forces. Union Confederate Lee's plan and movement to battle. By the morning of July 2, 6 of the 7th Corps of the Army of the Potomac had arrived on the battlefield. The 1st Corps and the 11th Corps had fought hard on the first day, and they were joined that evening by the yet unengaged troops of the 12th Corps, 3rd Corps, and 2nd Corps, and on the morning of July 2 by the 5th Corps. The 6th Corps was still 30 miles away in Manchester, Maryland, on that morning. They assumed positions in a fishhook shape about 3 miles long, from Culp's Hill, around to Cemetery Hill, and down the spine of Cemetery Ridge. The Army of Northern Virginia line was roughly parallel to the Union's on Cemetery Ridge and on an arc northwest, north, and northeast of the town of Gettysburg. All of the 2nd Corps and 3rd Corps were present, and the 1st Corps was arriving from Cashtown. Only Longstreet's division under George E. Pickett did not participate in the battle on July 2. Robert E. Lee had several choices to consider for his next move. His order of the previous evening that Ewell occupy Culp's Hill or Cemetery Hill, if practicable, was not realized, and the Union Army was now in strong defensive positions with compact interior lines. His senior subordinate, Longstreet, counseled a strategic move. The Army should leave its current position, swing around the Union left flank, and interpose itself on Meade's lines of communication, inviting an attack by Meade that could be received on advantageous ground. Longstreet argued that this was the entire point of the Gettysburg campaign, to move strategically into enemy territory but fight only defensive battles there. Lee rejected this argument because he was concerned about the morale of his soldiers having to give up the ground for which they fought so hard the day before. He wanted to retain the initiative and had a high degree of confidence in the ability of his army to succeed in any endeavor, an opinion bolstered by the spectacular victories the previous day and at Chancellorsville. He was therefore determined to attack on July 2. Lee wanted to seize the high ground south of Gettysburg, primarily Cemetery Hill. which dominated the town, the Union supply lines, and the road to Washington, D.C., and he believed an attack up the Emmitsburg Road would be the best approach. He desired an early morning assault by Longstreet's corps, reinforced by Ewell, who would move his corps from its current location north of town to join Longstreet. Ewell protested this arrangement, claiming his men would be demoralized if forced to move from the ground they had captured, and Longstreet protested that his division commanded by John Bell Hood had not arrived completely. Lee compromised with his subordinates. Ewell would remain in place and conduct a demonstration against Culp's Hill, pinning down the right flank of the Union defenders so that they could not reinforce the left, where Longstreet would launch the primary attack as soon as he was ready. Ewell's demonstration would be turned into a full-scale assault if the opportunity presented itself. Lee ordered Longstreet to launch a surprise attack with 2 divisions straddling and guiding on the Emmitsburg Road. Hood's division would move up the eastern side of the road, Lafayette-McLaws the western side, each perpendicular to it. The objective was to strike the Union Army in an oblique attack, rolling up the left flank, collapsing the line of Union corps onto each other, and seizing Cemetery Hill. The 3rd Corps Division of Richard H. Anderson would join the attack against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge at the appropriate time. This plan was based on faulty intelligence because of the absence of J.E.B. Stuart and his cavalry, leaving Lee with an incomplete understanding of the position of his enemy. He believed that the left flank of the Union Army was adjacent to the Emmitsburg Road, hanging in the air, and an early morning scouting expedition seemed to confirm that. In reality, by dawn of July 2, the Union line stretched the length of Cemetery Ridge and anchored at the foot of the imposing Little Round Top. Lee's plan was doomed from its conception, as Meade's line occupied only a small portion of the Emmitsburg Road near the town itself. Any force attacking up the road would find 2 entire Union corps and the guns posted on the ridge to their immediate right flank. By midday, however, Union General Sickles would change all that. Sickles repositions when Sickles arrived with his 3rd Corps. General Meade instructed him to take up a position on Cemetery Ridge that linked up with the 2nd Corps on his right and anchored his left on Little Round Top. Sickles originally did so, but after noon he became concerned about a slightly higher piece of ground 0.7 miles to his front, a peach orchard owned by the Sherfy family. He undoubtedly recalled the debacle at Chancellorsville, where the high ground he was forced to give up was used against him as a deadly Confederate artillery platform. Acting without authorization from Meade, Sickles marched his corps to occupy the peach orchard. This had 2 significant negative consequences. His position now took the form of a salient, which could be attacked from multiple sides, and he was forced to occupy lines that were much longer than his 2-division corps could defend. Meade was furious about this insubordination, but it was too late to do anything about it. The Confederate attack was imminent. Longstreet's attack was delayed, however, because he first had to wait for his final brigade to arrive, and then he was forced to march on a long, circuitous route that could not be seen by Union Army Signal Corps observers on Little Round Top. It was 4 p.m. by the time his 2 divisions reached their jumping-off points, and then he and his generals were astonished to find the 3rd Corps planted directly in front of them on the Emmitsburg Road. Hood argued with Longstreet that this new situation demanded a change in tactics. He wanted to swing around below and behind Round Top and hit the Union Army in the rear. Longstreet, however, refused to consider such a modification to Lee's order. Even so, and partly because of Sickles's unexpected location, Longstreet's assault did not proceed according to Lee's plan. Instead of wheeling left to join a simultaneous two-division push on either side of the Emmetsburg Road, Hood's division attacked in a more easterly direction than intended, and McLaws' and Anderson's divisions deployed brigade by brigade, in an en echelon style of attack, also heading more to the east than the intended northeast. Hood's assault. Longstreet's attack commenced with a 30-minute artillery barrage by 36 guns that was particularly punishing to the Union infantry in the Peach Orchard and the troops and batteries on Hook's Ridge. Marge. John Bell Hood's division deployed in Biseker's Woods on Warfield Ridge in two lines of 2 brigades each. At the left front, Brig. Gen. Jerome B. Robertson's Texas Brigade. Right front, Brig. Gen. Evander M. Law. Left rear, Brig. Gen. George T. Anderson. Right rear, Brig. Gen. Henry L. Benning. At 4:30 p.m., Hood stood in his stirrups at the front of the Texas Brigade and shouted, "Fix bayonets, my brave Texans! Forward and take those heights!" It is unclear to which heights he was referring. His orders were to cross the Emmetsburg Road and wheel left, moving north with his left flank guiding on the road. This discrepancy became a serious problem when, minutes later on Sliders Lane, Hood was felled by an artillery shell bursting overhead, severely wounding his left arm and putting him out of action. His division moved ahead to the east, no longer under central control. There were 4 probable reasons for the deviation in the division's direction. First, regiments from the 3rd Corps were unexpectedly in the Devil's Den area, and they would threaten Hood's right flank if they were not dealt with. Second, fire from the 2nd U.S. sharpshooters at Sliders Farm drew the attention of lead elements of Law's brigade, moving in pursuit and drawing his brigade to the right. Third, the terrain was rough and units naturally lost the parade ground alignments. Finally, Hood's senior subordinate, Gen. Law, was unaware that he was now in command of the division, so he could not exercise control. The 2 lead brigades split their advances into 2 directions, although not on brigade boundaries. The 1st Texas and 3rd Arkansas of Robertson's brigade and the 44th and 48th Alabama of Law's brigade headed in the direction of Devil's Den, while Law directed the remaining 5 regiments toward the Round Tops. Devil's Den was located at the extreme left of the 3rd Corps line, manned by the large brigade of Brigadier General J. H. Hobart Ward, in Marge. Gen. David B. Birney's division. It was the southern end of Hook's Ridge, a modest elevation on the northwest side of Plum Run Valley, made distinctive by piles of huge boulders. These boulders were not the direct avenue of approach used by the Confederates. The 3rd Arkansas and the 1st Texas drove through Rose Woods and hit Ward's line head-on. His troops had lacked the time or inclination to erect breastworks, and for over an hour both sides participated in a stand-up fight of unusual ferocity. In the first 30 minutes, the 20th Indiana lost more than half of its men. Its colonel, John Wheeler, was killed and its lieutenant colonel wounded. The 86th New York Corps also lost its commander. The commander of the 3rd Arkansas fell wounded, one of 182 casualties in his regiment. Meanwhile, the 2 regiments from Law's brigade that he had split from the column advancing to the Round Tops pushed up Plum Run Valley and threatened to turn Ward's flank. The target was the 4th Maine and the 124th New York, defending the 4th New York Independent Artillery Battery commanded by Captain James Smith, whose fire was causing considerable disruption in Law's brigade's advance. The pressure grew great enough that Ward needed to call the 99th Pennsylvania from his far right to reinforce his left. The commander of the 124th New York, Colonel Augustus Van Horn Ellis, and his major, James Cromwell, decided to counterattack. They mounted the horses despite the protests of soldiers who urged them to lead more safely on foot. March, Cromwell said, "The men must see us today." Quote, "They led the charge of the Orange Blossoms Regiment to the west, down the slope of Hook's Ridge through a triangular field surrounded by a low stone fence, sending the 1st Texas reeling back 200 yards. But both Colonel Ellis and Major Cromwell were shot dead as the Texans rallied with a massed volley, and the New Yorkers retreated to the starting point, with only 100 survivors from the 283 they started with. As reinforcements from the 99th Pennsylvania arrived, Ward's brigade retook the crest. The second wave of Hood's assault was the brigades of Henry Benning and George Tige Anderson. They detected a gap in Birney's division line. To Ward's right, there was a considerable gap before the brigade of R.E. Guise de Trebriand began. Anderson's line smashed into Trebriand and the gap at the southern edge of the wheat field. Trebriand read that the Confederates converged on me like an avalanche, but we piled all the dead and wounded men in our front. The Union defense was fierce, and Anderson's brigade pulled back. Its commander was wounded in the leg and was carried from the battle. Two of Benning's Confederate regiments, the 2nd and 17th Georgia, moved down Plum Run Valley around Ward's flank. They received murderous fire from the 99th Pennsylvania and Hazelwood's battery on Little Round Top, but they kept pushing forward. Captain Smith's New York battery was under severe pressure from three sides, but its supporting infantry regiments were suffering severe casualties and could not protect it. 3 10-pound Parrott rifles were lost to the 1st Texas, and they were used against Union troops the next day. Birney scrambled to find reinforcements. He sent the 40th New York and 6th New Jersey from the wheat field into Plum Run Valley to block the approach into Ward's flank. They collided with Benning's and Law's men in rocky, broken ground that the survivors would remember as the Slaughter Pen. Colonel Thomas W. Egan, commanding the 40th New York, was called on by Smith to recover his guns. The men of the Mozart Regiment slammed into the 2nd and 17th Georgia regiments, with initial success. As Ward's line along Hook's Ridge continued to collapse, the position manned by the 40th became increasingly untenable. However, Egan pressed his regiment onward, according to Col. Wesley Hodges of the 17th Georgia, launching 7 attacks against the Confederate positions within the boulders of Slaughter Pen and Devil's Den. As the men of the 40th fell back under relentless pressure, the 6th New Jersey covered their withdrawal and lost a third of its men in the process. The pressure on Ward's brigade was eventually too great, and he was forced to call for a retreat. Hood's division secured Devil's Den and the southern part of Hook's Ridge. The center of the fighting shifted to the northwest, to Rosewoods and the Wheatfield, while 5 regiments under Vanderloo assaulted Little Round Top to the east. Benning's men spent the next 22 hours on Devil's Den, firing across the Valley of Death on Union troops massed on Little Round Top. Of 2,423 Union troops engaged, there were 821 casualties. The 5,525 Confederates lost 1,814. Little Round Top. The Confederate assaults on Little Round Top were some of the most famous of the 3-day battle and the Civil War. Arriving just as the Confederates approached, Col. Strong Vincent's brigade of the 5th Corps mounted a spirited defensive this position, the extreme left of the Union line, against furious assaults up the rocky slope. The stand of the 20th Maine under Col. Joshua L. Chamberlain against the 15th Alabama is particularly storied, but heroes such as Strong Vincent, Patrick Paddy O'Rourke, and Charles E. Hazlitt also made names for themselves.